A newly married millionaire sees his life upended when the maid's daughter bursts into his office screaming. With eyes wide, the girl blurts a line that slices the air. "Your wife won't let your mother walk." From then on, small glitches in the routine pile up, as if someone were rewriting the reality around him. What looked like care was control, and what looked like love, a dark plan about to be revealed. Chapter 1: The Warning. Thomas Hartford stood at the window of his home office in Greenwich, Connecticut, reviewing quarterly reports when the door creaked open. He turned to find Emma, the housekeeper's daughter, standing in the doorway. The 10-year-old girl clutched a worn stuffed rabbit and shifted nervously from foot to foot. Her presence in his private office was unusual enough to make Thomas set down his papers and give her his full attention. Emma was typically shy, often hiding behind her mother's skirts when adults were present, so this intrusion carried weight. "Your wife does not let your mother walk and puts things in the tea," Emma said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating. Thomas felt his chest tighten as he processed what the child had just revealed. He knelt down to her eye level, careful not to frighten her further, and asked her to repeat what she had seen. Emma described moments when Catherine would gently but firmly press Eleanor's shoulders back into the wheelchair whenever the elderly woman tried to stand, and other times when she watched Catherine add drops from unmarked bottles into cups and soup bowls when no one else was around. Thomas thanked Emma and watched her scurry away, his mind racing through the implications. His mother Eleanor had been declining rapidly over the past 6 months, losing mobility without any clear medical explanation. The specialists had run countless tests, all returning inconclusive results. Eleanor had always been active, walking daily through the estate gardens, but now she barely left her wheelchair. Catherine had taken charge of all care routines with devotion that seemed admirable, handling medications, therapy sessions, and dietary requirements with meticulous attention. Everyone praised her dedication to her mother-in-law, commenting on how lucky Eleanor was to have such a caring daughter-in-law. But now a child's observation had planted a seed of doubt that Thomas could not ignore. He thought back over recent months, searching for signs he might have missed. Catherine had indeed become the sole manager of Eleanor's care, insisting that she understood the complex requirements better than anyone else. She had dismissed the previous nurse, claiming the woman was incompetent, and had taken over all medication administration personally. Thomas had been grateful at the time, relieved that someone was taking such comprehensive responsibility while he managed the family business and various estate matters. That evening, Thomas sat at dinner with Catherine and noticed details he had previously overlooked. The way Catherine monitored Eleanor's every movement, the quick correction when Eleanor reached for her own water glass, the subtle redirection when Eleanor tried to speak directly to Thomas. Catherine's voice remained sweet and patient throughout, but there was an edge of control that Thomas was only now beginning to perceive. When he suggested that perhaps they should get a second opinion from another specialist, Catherine smiled and agreed, but her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her fork. Later that night, unable to sleep, Thomas walked through the silent house. He found himself standing outside Eleanor's room, listening to the quiet sounds of her breathing. His mother had raised him alone after his father passed, building the Hartford fortune through shrewd investments and tireless work. She had been strong, independent, fierce even. The frail woman in that bedroom seemed like a shadow of who she had been. Thomas made a decision then, standing in that darkened hallway. He would watch, observe, and document everything. If Emma's words held truth, he needed to understand what was happening in his own home before taking any action. The next morning, Thomas began paying closer attention to the household rhythms. He noticed that Catherine kept Eleanor's therapy room locked when not in use, claiming it contained expensive equipment that needed protection. He observed how Catherine always prepared Eleanor's meals personally, never allowing the kitchen staff to handle her mother-in-law's food. He saw how visitors were gently discouraged, with Catherine explaining that Eleanor tired easily and needed rest. Each observation added another piece to a puzzle Thomas was only beginning to assemble. During a business meeting later that week, Thomas found his concentration wavering. His assistant repeated a question twice before Thomas registered the words. Catherine appeared at the conference room door with a concerned expression, bringing him vitamins and water, explaining to everyone that he had been working too hard and needed to take better care of himself. The board members smiled sympathetically, and Thomas felt a strange disconnection, as if watching himself from outside his own body. He thanked Catherine automatically, but inside a question formed that he could not shake. Why had she come to his office building unannounced? How had she known he was in a meeting at that exact moment? The timing felt orchestrated, in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable, though he could not articulate exactly why. Chapter 2. Growing Doubts. Thomas began keeping a private journal, documenting everything he observed. Small incidents that he might have previously dismissed now took on new significance. A medication bottle that disappeared from the bathroom cabinet, only to reappear 3 days later in a different location. A water glass he distinctly remembered placing in the dishwasher that somehow ended up back in the cupboard, clean and untouched. Catherine mentioned a conversation about visiting her sister in Boston, but when Thomas referenced it days later, she looked at him with gentle concern and insisted no such conversation had ever occurred. The disconnection between his memory and reality began to create a fog in Thomas's mind. He started second-guessing himself, wondering if the stress of managing the Hartford estate and businesses was affecting his mental clarity. Other people seemed to notice too. James, the estate manager who had worked for the family for 15 years, pulled Thomas aside one afternoon and suggested that perhaps Thomas should consider taking a vacation, noting that he seemed forgetful and distracted lately. Even Eleanor's previous physician, Dr. Chen, mentioned during a chance encounter at the country club that Thomas looked exhausted and should prioritize his own health. Catherine reinforced these observations with loving concern. She would remind him of appointments he had supposedly forgotten, produce calendar entries that Thomas had no memory of making, and gently suggest that perhaps he was taking on too much responsibility. Her care for him mirrored her care for Eleanor, comprehensive and total, leaving little room for independent action. Thomas found himself relying more heavily on her organizational skills, even as a voice in the back of his mind whispered warnings he could not quite articulate. One afternoon, when Catherine left the estate to run errands in town, Thomas seized the opportunity to spend time alone with his mother. He wheeled Eleanor out to the garden terrace, where afternoon sun filtered through the old oak trees. Eleanor's hands trembled as they rested in her lap, and when Thomas asked if she was comfortable, her response came slowly, words slurred as if moving through honey. She looked at him with eyes that held something Thomas could only describe as desperation, a plea for help that she could not voice clearly. Thomas asked his mother directly if anything was wrong, if she needed anything, if there was something she wanted to tell him. Eleanor's mouth opened and closed several times before she managed to whisper a single word that chilled Thomas to his core. "Careful," she said. Just that one word, but the weight behind it carried volumes. Before Thomas could press further, they heard Catherine's car in the driveway, returning earlier than expected. Eleanor's expression shifted immediately to something neutral, almost blank, and Thomas understood instinctively that his mother was protecting him from something, though he could not yet comprehend what. That evening, Thomas made an excuse about needing files from the estate's library and spent 2 hours searching through old family records and documents. He was not entirely sure what he was looking for, but intuition drove him forward. In a box of his mother's personal papers, he found Eleanor's old daily planner from the year before her decline began. The handwriting was strong and clear, filled with appointments, notes, and observations written in his mother's characteristic, precise script. Thomas compared it to more recent attempts at writing he had seen, shaky and barely legible, and the contrast was stark. The deterioration had been rapid and severe, yet no medical professional had been able to provide an adequate explanation. Hidden between the pages of the planner, Thomas discovered something else. A small slip of paper with Eleanor's handwriting, though less steady than the planner entries, bearing a message that made his blood run cold. "Not sick," the note read. "Something wrong, help." The paper was dated approximately 3 months earlier, around the time when Eleanor's condition had worsened significantly and Catherine had taken over complete control of her care. Thomas folded the note carefully and placed it in his wallet. evidence of something he still could not fully name, but knew he needed to preserve. The following week, Thomas began to notice patterns in Catherine's behavior. She administered Eleanor's medications at very specific times, always in private, never allowing anyone else to handle the pills or liquids. She kept detailed logs in a locked notebook, which Thomas glimpsed once when Catherine left it briefly on the kitchen counter. The columns contained dates, times, and cryptic notations like increase, reduce, slower response, and resistance. These were not standard medical terms a caregiver would typically use, and the clinical detachment of the language disturbed Thomas deeply. He photographed the page quickly with his phone before Catherine returned. Thomas also noticed that Catherine had begun isolating Eleanor more completely. Visits from Eleanor's friends were discouraged, with explanations that Eleanor was having a difficult day or needed rest. Phone calls were monitored, with Catherine often taking the receiver and explaining that Eleanor was not feeling up to conversation. Even Thomas's own time with his mother became supervised, with Catherine finding reasons to interrupt or join them, her presence a constant barrier to private communication. The house that had once felt warm and open now seemed to close in around them, every room containing invisible boundaries that Thomas was only beginning to perceive clearly. Chapter 3. The Discovery. The opportunity Thomas had been waiting for arrived on a Tuesday morning when Catherine announced she would be attending a charity luncheon in Manhattan that would keep her away for most of the day. Thomas feigned interest in a conference call and waited until her car disappeared down the tree-lined driveway before making his move. He had been planning this investigation for days, knowing he needed concrete evidence to understand what was truly happening in his home. The therapy room door, usually locked, had been left open in Catherine's hurry to depart on time. Thomas entered the space that had become his mother's primary treatment area, a converted sunroom at the back of the house. Medical equipment lined one wall, including a motorized table, resistance bands, and various therapeutic devices that seemed legitimate enough. But it was the storage cabinet that drew Thomas's attention, particularly the locked drawer at the bottom that Catherine kept a key for on her personal keychain. Thomas had learned basic lockpicking from a security consultant years earlier during a corporate safety training, and the simple cabinet lock yielded quickly to his amateur efforts. Inside, he found a collection that made his stomach turn. Unmarked bottles containing clear and amber liquids, small containers of white powder, and prescription medication bottles with labels that had been partially removed or obscured. There were syringes, measuring droppers, and mixing containers, all arranged with careful organization. Most disturbing was a leather-bound journal filled with Catherine's handwriting, containing detailed logs that read like a clinical experiment rather than care notes. Thomas photographed everything with trembling hands, making sure to capture the journal pages that detailed dosages, timing, and observations about Eleanor's responses. The entries dated back 8 months, coinciding with the beginning of Eleanor's decline. Phrases jumped out at him from the pages. Subject showing increased weakness, one entry noted. Reduced resistance to positioning today, another observed. The language was cold, detached, as if Eleanor were not a person but a specimen being studied. Thomas felt bile rise in his throat as he read, but he forced himself to document every page methodically. As he continued searching, Thomas discovered purchase receipts tucked into an envelope at the back of the drawer. The items included various supplements and compounds that, while not illegal, were certainly not part of any standard medical treatment plan. There were also receipts from a medical supply company for items like feeding tubes and catheter equipment, suggesting a level of intervention that Eleanor's actual condition did not warrant. Each piece of evidence painted a picture of preparation, of someone planning for increased dependence and decreased mobility, rather than recovery and rehabilitation. Thomas heard a sound from the hallway and froze, but it was only Emma passing by with her mother. The little girl peeked into the room and, seeing Thomas, entered quietly. She pointed to a specific cabinet and whispered that she had seen Catherine mixing things there many times, especially when preparing Eleanor's evening tea. Emma described watching Catherine measure drops carefully from different bottles, mixing them in a small glass, before adding the mixture to the teapot. The child's observations provided context for the items Thomas had discovered. confirming that this was not merely improper storage, but active use. Thomas thanked Emma and quickly finished his documentation, replacing everything exactly as he had found it. He locked the drawer and left the room, his mind racing with the implications of what he had uncovered. Back in his office, he reviewed the photographs and notes, trying to make sense of the pattern. The medications and supplements, when combined, could certainly cause the symptoms his mother was experiencing. Muscle weakness, cognitive dulling, loss of coordination, all could result from the prolonged administration of sedatives and relaxants in inappropriate doses. But the question that haunted Thomas was why. Catherine had everything she could want as his wife. The Hertford estate was vast, the family wealth substantial, and Catherine had access to all of it through their marriage. What possible motivation could drive someone to systematically undermine an elderly woman's health? Thomas thought about their relationship, about how Catherine had entered his life 5 years earlier at a charity gala, elegant and charming, with impeccable social credentials. She had been attentive to Eleanor from the beginning, cultivating a relationship with his mother that had seemed genuinely warm. As Thomas sat in his office that afternoon, waiting for Catherine's return, he realized he needed help. This situation had grown beyond what he could handle alone, and involving law enforcement at this stage seemed premature without more definitive proof of intent. He needed a medical professional who could assess the situation objectively and help him understand exactly what was being done to his mother. Dr. Sarah Morrison came to mind immediately, Eleanor's longtime physician, who had been quietly removed from her care 6 months, earlier when Catherine insisted on bringing in specialists who supposedly had more experience with Eleanor's mysterious condition. Thomas made the call, speaking carefully, asking Dr. Morrison if she would be willing to examine Eleanor discreetly under the guise of a routine house call. The doctor, who had known the Hertford family for 2 decades, agreed immediately, sensing the urgency in Thomas's voice, even though he could not explain everything over the phone. They scheduled the visit for the following week, timing it for when Catherine would be occupied with another commitment. Thomas felt the first stirring of hope since Emma's initial revelation, a sense that perhaps he was finally taking concrete action to protect his mother from whatever forces were working against her health and independence. Chapter 4. Medical Truth. Dr. Sarah Morrison arrived at the Hertford estate on a bright Thursday morning, carrying her medical bag and wearing an expression of professional concern. Thomas had arranged for Catherine to be at a garden club meeting, ensuring they would have at least 2 hours of uninterrupted time. The doctor greeted Eleanor warmly, and Thomas watched as his mother's face brightened with recognition and relief at seeing a familiar, trusted presence. It was the most animated Eleanor had appeared in months, suggesting that perhaps her cognitive decline was not as severe as Catherine had been reporting. The examination took place in Eleanor's bedroom, with Thomas present at his mother's unspoken request. Dr. Morrison conducted a thorough assessment, checking reflexes, muscle tone, coordination, and cognitive responses. What she found puzzled her immediately. Eleanor's muscle tone was decreased, yes, but her deep tendon reflexes were not consistent with progressive neurological conditions. The pattern suggested something pharmaceutical rather than pathological. Eleanor's cognition, when given time to respond without pressure, was remarkably intact, contradicting the reports of severe cognitive impairment that Catherine had been sharing with specialists. The doctor asked Eleanor to describe her daily routine, and with effort, the elderly woman explained how Catherine controlled everything from her medication schedule to her meals, from her therapy sessions to her visitors. Eleanor mentioned feeling increasingly drowsy after taking her morning medications, experiencing tremors that worsened throughout the day, and having difficulty forming thoughts clearly, as if her mind was moving through fog. These symptoms would typically ease somewhat by early morning before the first round of medications, only to return as the day progressed. Dr. Morrison's expression grew grave as she listened. She excused herself to speak privately with Thomas in the hallway, leaving a nurse's aide with Eleanor. Once they were alone, the doctor explained that the symptom pattern suggested systematic administration of sedatives, muscle relaxants, or similar compounds. She needed laboratory analysis to confirm, but everything she observed pointed toward pharmaceutical intervention rather than natural illness progression. The doctor emphasized that this could be intentional harm or could represent a tragic misunderstanding of proper medication administration, but either way, Eleanor was in danger. Thomas showed Dr. Morrison the photographs he had taken of the therapy room supplies and the journal entries. The doctor studied them carefully, her frown deepening. She recognized some of the compounds from the bottles, noting that several, while available over the counter or online, could produce precisely the effects Eleanor was experiencing when combined or administered in improper doses. The journal entries particularly concerned her, as they documented a pattern of experimentation and adjustment rather than following any legitimate medical protocol. Dr. Morrison stated firmly that they needed to collect samples for toxicology testing and document Eleanor's current condition thoroughly. Over the next hour, Dr. Morrison discreetly collected blood samples, hair samples, and took detailed photographs of Eleanor's physical presentation. She also conducted a more extensive cognitive assessment, which revealed that Eleanor's mental capacity was far better than recent medical reports suggested. When given adequate time to respond without interruption, Eleanor could recall details, solve problems, and engage in complex reasoning. The fog that Catherine had described as dementia appeared to be pharmaceutical suppression rather than cognitive illness. Thomas felt a mixture of rage and relief. Rage that someone had been systematically harming his mother, and relief that her condition was not the irreversible decline they had been led to believe. Dr. Morrison cautioned him against confronting Catherine directly until they had definitive laboratory results and a clear plan. They needed to understand exactly what compounds were involved, assess Eleanor's overall health status, and determine the safest way to transition her off whatever regimen she was currently receiving. Abrupt cessation of certain medications could be medically dangerous, so they would need to proceed carefully. The doctor arranged for Eleanor to begin a gradual reduction in her current medication schedule, substituting some of the doses with placebos while monitoring her response. She would return in 3 days to assess improvement and collect additional samples. In the meantime, Thomas would need to maintain appearances with Catherine, acting as if nothing had changed while secretly implementing the doctor's intervention plan. It would require careful coordination and constant vigilance, but Dr. Morrison assured him that with proper medical support, Eleanor could recover significant function. That evening, Catherine returned from her meeting full of cheerful conversation about the garden club's fall fundraiser plans. She checked on Eleanor routinely, administering the evening medications as always, unaware that Thomas had already substituted several of the bottles with harmless alternatives prepared by Dr. Morrison. Thomas watched the interaction with new eyes, seeing the control and manipulation that he had previously interpreted as devotion. Catherine's touch was gentle, her voice soothing, but there was an undertone of ownership in how she managed Eleanor's body and space, positioning her exactly so, timing everything precisely. Later that night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay awake beside Catherine, this woman he had loved and trusted, wondering who she really was and what had driven her to harm his mother. The questions multiplied in his mind without answers. In the darkness, he heard Catherine's steady breathing and felt the enormous gulf between them, a distance that had been growing for months without his recognition. Tomorrow, Dr. Morrison's laboratory would begin processing the samples. In a few days, they would have scientific confirmation of what Thomas already knew in his heart. His mother was not sick. She was being made sick, and the person responsible slept peacefully beside him, unaware that her carefully constructed reality was about to collapse. Chapter 5. The Revelation. The laboratory results arrived via secure courier on a Monday afternoon, confirming Dr. Morrison's suspicions with scientific precision. Eleanor's blood and tissue samples showed consistent levels of benzodiazepines, muscle relaxants, and other sedating compounds at doses that would have required systematic administration over months. The levels were not immediately life-threatening, but they were sufficient to produce profound weakness, cognitive dulling, and progressive loss of function. Armed with this evidence, Thomas felt a strange combination of vindication and horror. His mother had been slowly disabled by chemical means, her independence stolen drop by drop. That evening, Thomas arranged for Emma's mother to take the child away for the night, wanting to spare her from what was about to unfold. He waited until after dinner, when Eleanor had been settled in her room and the house staff had finished their duties. Then in the library, where they had shared so many quiet evenings, Thomas confronted Catherine with the evidence. He laid out the laboratory reports, the photographs of the therapy room supplies, the journal entries, and Dr. Morrison's medical assessment. He asked one simple question: why? Catherine's reaction was masterful. She looked at the documents with apparent shock, her face draining of color as tears formed in her eyes. She reached for Thomas with trembling hands, her voice breaking as she insisted this was a mistake, a terrible misunderstanding. She had only been following the treatment plan, she claimed, the one prescribed by the specialist Dr. Chen had recommended. Catherine explained that she had been trying to help, administering supplements and therapies that were supposed to stimulate Eleanor's recovery, not harm her. Her distress seemed genuine, her confusion palpable. But Thomas pressed further, asking about the journal entries, the clinical language, the careful documentation of doses and responses. Catherine's explanation faltered, and she grasped at different threads. Perhaps she had been recording too meticulously, she suggested. Perhaps the specialist had given her the wrong guidance. She looked at Thomas with wide eyes and asked if he was feeling well, noting that he seemed stressed and perhaps needed rest himself. The deflection was subtle but clear, an attempt to turn the focus back onto Thomas's mental state rather than her actions. Thomas refused to be distracted. He explained that Dr. Morrison had examined Eleanor and found no underlying neurological condition, that the symptoms were entirely consistent with pharmaceutical intervention, and that Eleanor was already showing improvement after just days of reduced medication. Catherine's expression shifted then, the tears drying as something harder emerged. She stood and walked to the window, her back to Thomas, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its tremulous quality. She told him a story he had never heard before. Catherine described her childhood in a working-class neighborhood in New Haven, watching her mother work multiple jobs to support them after her father left. She spoke of cleaning houses for wealthy families, of seeing how the other half lived, of the resentment that grew with each polished floor and each served meal. One family in particular had employed her mother for years, an elderly matriarch who had been kind but patronizing, treating Catherine's mother with benevolent condescension that had stung more than outright rudeness. When Catherine met Thomas at that charity gala 5 years earlier, she had recognized his family name. The Hartfords had been part of the same social circle as the family her mother had served. They represented everything Catherine had wanted and everything she had resented. Marrying Thomas had felt like victory, like finally entering the world that had always existed just beyond her reach. But Eleanor, with her old money grace and her quiet judgment, had made Catherine feel like an outsider, despite the wedding ring. Every gentle correction, every subtle suggestion about proper ways to do things, had reinforced the gap between Catherine's origins and the Hartford legacy. The specialist, Catherine confessed, was not what she had claimed. She had met him online, on a forum for people dealing with difficult family situations. He had presented himself as a medical professional who understood how to help caregivers manage challenging elderly relatives. His advice had been to use certain supplements and medications to keep Eleanor calm and manageable, to make caregiving easier. Catherine had followed his guidance without question, trusting that he knew best, wanting to prove herself capable of handling Eleanor's care without help from the Hartford family's network of professionals. What Catherine had not realized, or perhaps had refused to acknowledge, was that the guidance was gradually incapacitating Eleanor rather than treating her. The specialist had convinced Catherine that Eleanor's resistance to treatment was part of her illness, that her attempts to maintain independence were symptoms of cognitive decline. He had taught Catherine to document everything, to adjust doses based on Eleanor's responses, to view her mother-in-law as a patient to be managed rather than a person to be supported. In following his instructions, Catherine had become an unwitting instrument of harm, her own insecurities and resentments manipulated by someone who saw an opportunity for exploitation. Thomas listened to Catherine's confession with a mixture of anger and pity. She had caused tremendous harm, whether through malice or misguided trust. and Eleanor had suffered because of it. But Catherine's story also revealed a darker truth, that she had been vulnerable to manipulation because of her own pain, her own sense of not belonging, her own need to prove worth in a world that had always made her feel lesser. The specialist, whoever he was, had weaponized those feelings, turning Catherine into someone who could harm an elderly woman while believing she was providing care.